editing Sheree here just to pop in very quickly to say that we needed to give a content warning for this episode. So this episode does discuss abusive practices, disordered eating and eating disorders, sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and harassment and death. So if this isn't for you today, please feel free to click off of this video and we'll see you again another time. Welcome back to FSL TV. Today, Stephen and I are back with another FSL Book Club. So, Stephen, do you want to introduce to us which book we read for this
Yes,
book?
I'm happy to do so. And first of all, I've got to say, it's a shame we're not together doing this sort of in person. We're having to do it
Yes.
online.
We usually try to do them together, but
Yeah, but our schedules haven't quite worked out this time. So
that's all right.
I don't know if it will come across as not quite as good, but we'll try our
The
best.
content will be just as good. It's just our backgrounds are different
I
today.
think the content will be good because what we're going to be talking about today is a book that for a number of years you've told me I should read.
I have.
It's a book you'd already read, but you have reread it for the purposes of this, haven't you? And it's
Yes, because it's one of my favorite books, and I think it is one of those that I reread every few years
right.
because it just stays relevant in
So
so
I
many
can,
ways.
yeah, I totally understand why it's one of your favorite books. So this is Joan Ryan's Little Girls in Pretty Boxes.
That's right.
And I only saw at the very end when I read a biography. So this is in Sports Illustrated's list of top 100 sports books of all time.
Really? Oh, I did not
Yes.
know that.
And
Wow.
it's in The Guardian,
Yeah.
The Guardian's top 50 sport books of all time.
Wow. Oh, I had no idea because it does seem a little bit of an under the radar book in many
Yes, I know
ways.
what you mean.
That I don't even think many sports scholars, at least in the sport and exercise medicine world, has read. I've got a
Really?
slightly different edition to
Yes,
yours.
yes, because you've had it for a while, you'd already read it.
Yes, that's right.
I just got the latest edition, which I think has an extra introduction that you might not have.
Yes, I think
It's
so.
got a foreword by Jamie Dancher, former Olympic gymnast. Have you?
Yeah, mine does not have that.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So just to set the scene, this
Mhm.
book is about gymnastics and a bit less, but also about figure skating,
That's right.
which on the surface you might think they're two very different sports. One's in a gymnasium, one's in the ice rink. Why is
Mm.
a book about those two things? But absolutely, Joan Ryan connects them because,
Mm.
as the title suggests, they're both about little girls who get put into pretty boxes.
That's right. And both, if we say that more forthcomingly, is both about child labor, really, is what those sports have been.
So let me sort of start with an admission. I mean, I was absolutely shocked by this book. It has completely changed the way that I view those sports.
Has it? Tell me more. I want to know why it's shocked you and changed your view.
Well, here's a bit of autobiography. In 1976, I watched the Montreal Olympics uh,
Mm.
with fascination, in particular with Nadia Comaneci.
Of course, the perfect tens.
Yeah, so this
Mm.
Romanian gymnast. So in 1976, I would have been 10 years old myself, coincidentally,
So
and
very similar age to her.
yes,
Mm.
and so I was absolutely transfixed by Nadia Comaneci, and I've enjoyed gymnastics ever since, right?
Mm.
So I kind of thought it's a beautiful aesthetic sport. It's so wonderful to watch.
It is one of those, and I think Joan Ryan talks about this, that it's like one of the most watched Olympic sports that comes around every
Yes,
4 years. Everyone watches the gymnastics at the Olympics. Yeah.
but I'm sorry to say,
Mm.
yes, it has changed my mind because I mean, the clues you've already given a clue. um, is this child labor? So she documents how since Olga Korbut in 72 and then Nadia Comaneci in 76, there was this increasing fashion for gymnastics to be about little girls and small bodies, pre-pubescent bodies, which until then it sounds like it wasn't quite that.
No.
But it's absolutely shocking to see that some of these athletes are 12 years old, or they were. Obviously, there's been some development since this book was written, but at the
Mm.
time, we're talking about children, and they maybe start some of these sports younger than that, 8 years old, 5 years old, and it's about the sacrifices that are made. These athletes are losing their childhood, and they're basically just in the gym night and day.
Mm.
And some of the revelations in the book I find completely shocking. The idea that
Mm.
children leave their parental home at 8 years old and go and live in a training camp.
That's right. Or
It's
go and live with a coach. That was really
yes.
shocking to me. So, yeah, this whole book is very much about showing that juxtaposition between what we see at the Olympics, which is this, little girls in pretty boxes, these pretty little girls doing these incredible feats, really really well made up and doing these beautiful things and smiling, and then Joan Ryan shows what is actually going on behind the scenes to get
Mm,
those little girls to that point. And that's why I said child labor, because she tells the whole story about how these kids from the time that they're 3 5 years old are put into massively heavy gymnastics training because their careers are over by the time they hit puberty. So by the time they're 15 or 16, at least in this era, their careers were over because they were, seen to be too heavy, too big, too womanly
mm,
to be part of the sport. And so all those sacrifices are the leaving home, living in training camps, training 12 hours a day, not going to school, their parents not supporting their childhoods and so on, then playing through injury and pain. And so Joan Ryan, I think, opens up the door to all of that and explains it in the book.
Yeah, and that the way in which it's become about these tiny bodies
Mm.
comes at all sorts of costs, doesn't it? So
Mm.
maybe we could run through some of the chapters because she
Okay.
has it's 7 or 8 chapters and they're
Mm.
themed around certain issues,
That's
and
right.
it kind of works out the implications of these tiny bodies being
Mm.
so prized and successful in the sport. So there was a
Mm.
realization that to succeed at the sport, you
Mm.
had to be a certain way. So, for instance, well, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to start on, but I mean, one place.
Yeah, so I think the starting point is where did this come from? So prior to that era that we're talking about, so probably between, what did you say, 76 and
Yeah,
about
coming at just 76.
1996. Yeah, in that kind of time period, 76, it was there was some defection of coaches um
Yes,
across
Bella Caroli.
Caroli. Yes,
He was the Romanian coach of Nadi Comaneci,
that's right.
and then moved to the United States
Mm.
and took on these coaching roles. And
That's
he,
right.
so one thing she talks about in one of the chapters, most of these figures we read about, the successful coaches, have got no sort of formal education
No.
in in
Coaching,
coaching,
in
in
sports
sport, in
science,
biology. And
psychology. Yeah.
yes, so Bella Caroli was he kind of ran his training camps like a military operation,
Well,
wasn't it?
that's it. Yeah. So that's what I was going to say. Bella and his wife Marta were these Romanian coaches who pioneered, I guess, the idea of a very small, very light gymnast with Nadia Comaneci, and then going over to the States and doing the same thing. So before them, gymnastics was a woman's sport,
Mm.
but Bella and Marta kind of believed that the smaller and the lighter and the prettier the little girls were, the more marks they would get, the more they'd be able to do points and so on in the gymnastics world. And so they really are that like turning point for why we move into this era of very young girls
Mm.
going to the Olympics and partaking in these sports. And so, yeah, because they're little girls who are training 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in the gym. The first chapter in this book is about injuries. And I love that the chapter's title is If It Isn't Bleeding, Don't Worry About It. Because that really does seem to be the whole ethos of this time in training. Like all of these athletes had to train through injury. Through major injury often, and there was no, it was relentless on them.
Yeah, so this was like one of the first of many shocking chapters. Um, and maybe I mean, it's pretty obvious when you think of it. It's a very dangerous sport, isn't it? So there's injuries are fairly frequent, but
Mm.
Karolyi, with it being a sort of military camp, he would force them to carry on through the injuries,
That's right.
carry on doing these spectacular feats that put a massive strain on the body.
Mm.
And the book's full of examples throughout of these young girls still competing, still
Mm.
training and competing with major injuries, with spinal injuries, with broken bones, with torn ligaments, often
That's right.
quite a few cases where the ligaments have been screwed back in place.
That's
And
right.
then you're back in training the next day after having an operation like that.
And these young girls just being pumped full of pain medication and just
Yes.
forced to go through with that
Yeah,
and
so
to
they were
continue training. And we
habitually
should say the
taking,
reason why it was like that and these little girls couldn't say no was because they were put into this environment where they were told and they were taught that if they comply with all of this, then they will be that Olympic champion.
yes,
And this era of coaches saw these little girls as expendable, right? If your body
yeah,
wasn't strong enough, or actually, as we should say, if you didn't suck it up and just follow their training and do what they said, you'd be out, and the next little girl would be in. So you were very expendable to them. They just saw it as a factory of little girls coming through, and the ones who were forced to put up with the worst of the worst behavior were the ones who made it to the Olympics. But at what cost is the question.
yeah, and another aspect of that, which I think sort of even more extreme, it was also the case in these training camps that if you ever questioned or went against the coach, you would be thrown out. So
That's right.
your Olympic dream would be over just for daring to question anything that the coach told you to do,
Mm,
which clearly has led to this complete erosion of bodily autonomy. You
that's
know, that
right.
once you joined the training camp, your body didn't belong to yourself.
No.
And so if
No,
you,
you were a commodity for the coaches and for the Gymnastics
yeah,
Federation as a medal prospect. That's all that you were. You
yeah,
weren't a human being anymore. And I think that for me is the one of the biggest takeaways and stories of this book is how these little girls are turned into commodities to win
mm,
gold medals.
mm.
They're not little girls anymore. Yeah.
But then I think it's the next chapter. It's
Mm,
back on this idea of it being a sport for young girls is the eating disorders.
mm,
It's about the athletes knowing that they, if possible, by any
mm.
means, they had to delay the onset of puberty.
That's
They had
right.
to remain a little girl for as long as possible, because as soon as they became a woman
Mhm.
with breasts, with a woman's body,
Mm.
with hips, it would signal the end of their career.
Well,
And
it would literally be the end of their career. So
yeah,
we read that coaches were extremely abusive, weighing athletes in, verbally abusing them if they put on any weight. And so,
yes.
when puberty hits in, people do grow. They go through a growth spurt, their bodies change. And the moment that happened for any of these girls, they were out. And again, that's another way in which their careers were so short and had such a small time window in which to like be this Olympic gymnast. And so, things like disordered eating and eating disorders, and self-harm in various other ways were rife, because that is a way to delay puberty. And so these girls felt that they had no other choice. That's just what they were being told to do. And so you see eating disorders being very rife, and the less you eat and the more you train, you are going to put off puberty.
Yeah, well, that's something I've not fully grasped or thought about,
Mm,
but basically, these athletes were getting insufficient nutrition,
mm,
and it meant that their bodies weren't entering puberty.
mm.
So many of the athletes had amenorrhea, which is not
Lack of
a lack of
menstruation.
menstruation, but
Mm,
also because I saw it was 2 to 3 times more common in the athletes than in general
mm,
population. But also this lack of nutrition around
mm.
puberty leads to long-term health problems like osteoporosis, for
That's
instance.
right. So, can I tell you something really interesting about this? A
Yes.
little bit of the history of this as a sports medicine health problem. So, in the book, we read about this 1992 piece of work. This only comes later in the book,
Yes.
but that defines what at the time I think they called the female triad, which was this kind of medical indication of someone not having enough energy, so not taking in enough nutrients, injuries coming up, and then that lack of menstruation and lack of puberty. So we start to recognize this, and it was called the female triad at the time, and later developed into a term, female athlete triad, which we still hear very often. And any of these kinds of aesthetic sports are often very much athletes who are in the aesthetic sports are at risk of this female athlete triad because of those pressures that are on them. But we do see this in other sports as well. This is quite common across sports. However, what's really interesting, and I think related to our feminist conception of sport and of these issues, is more recently we've done away with the term female athlete triad within sports medicine. And we now talk about something which is termed RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. So it is that same cluster of symptoms or outcomes from having an energy deficiency, not eating enough, exercising too much, that can have these devastating impacts on the body. But the reason why we moved away from the term female athlete triad, because it is now recognized that this happens in boys and men as well. So boys and men, if you're not eating enough, not getting enough nutrition, but over exercising, being trained too much, you will also get injuries, osteoporosis, all of those things. The amenorrhea might not be one of the symptoms, but there will be other symptoms. So I really find that a fascinating development of
Mm.
female athlete triad to relative energy deficiency.
Yes, it was
Slightly
it was
beside the point
gendered.
here,
It
but it was
seems it
very
was
gendered.
yeah, it was unnecessarily gendered, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
You
That's right.
mentioned the 1992 the Washington study, was it?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
so this study found so it was into eating disorders.
Mm,
And the study, the numbers I noted down, 18% of the general female population had eating disorders, but
mm.
32% of female athletes and an astonishing 62% of female gymnasts. So Yeah,
Shocking.
it is
Absolutely. For
shocking.
something that is preventable and does not need to be it, but is now part of the sport because the sport has demanded small,
Demanded it,
tiny bodies,
and
prepubescent bodies.
it was kind of encouraged by the coaches, wasn't it? So first of all, the things you said,
Kind of. It was massively encouraged by the
it was
coaches.
massively, but first of all, indirectly, because of all these
Mm.
comments about um, you're looking fat. People, the
Mm.
coaches would say, even when, I mean, clearly these were tiny bodies, but if they would be weighed all the time, and if they just put on 1 pound, they'd be told all these
Mm-hmm.
slurs.
That's
Uh,
right.
but also, it seems inconceivable to think that the coaches didn't know that the eating disorders
Oh,
were
they
ongoing.
absolutely knew. And I think what's come to light in later years when there have been some reports around this, particularly after the NASA abuse came to light, was that coaches absolutely knew, but there was a
Mm.
culture of silence around all of this. So do you know what's really fascinating? As we've been reading this book, I've gone back and watched some of those Olympic finals again.
Yes.
So I went back, particularly the 1992 final and 1996 final, I wanted to watch again. And even on the TV broadcast of it, they would broadcast the athlete's height and weight. So when it came up with the athlete's name, it would be their name, their nationality, their weight, their height, and their weight, which is not something that you see anymore, but that shows. And the commentators would talk about it. Oh, here's a 77-pound athlete. Oh, here's a
Yeah.
110-pound athlete. And all of those commentary that was like kind of in the water at the time of what was seen as a good athlete just because she happened to be lighter. Now, I'm really pleased to say that's changed over time for many different
Mm.
reasons because of research, but also, there are other things that changed, and we now recognize athletes like Simone Biles. Okay, Simone Biles is a small human being, but she's really powerful and strong and muscular and can do
Yes.
so many more feats than those athletes could because she has that power and those muscles. But what I wanted to say, oh, I have so much to say. With the weighing, you would think that we've done away with weighing and that doesn't happen anymore. But just within the last 2 years, I'm aware of a new policy that was put out by British Gymnastics about weighing, and weighing is still happening in gymnastics. It's still allowed and sanctioned. It's now kind of put under the guise of medical care, so to make sure that athletes don't develop red S and so on. But I wonder if that still plays into a culture in which your weight seems to be a thing that's important about you.
Mm. I mean, just in case the viewers think, these problems are maybe not as serious.
Mm,
Well, in both the cases that we've discussed so far has been as serious as resulting in an athlete's death, hasn't it?
definitely, that's
So
right.
with injuries, there's the story in the book. And the book, Joan Ryan is a journalist, and I think
Mm,
she's constructing that narrative around it. So the book's full of stories, very personal stories about people's lives.
mm,
So Julissa Gomez is an athlete who died with an injury,
mm.
um, and can spare some of those details because it really is
Yeah.
tragic. In
Mm.
fact,
Mm.
didn't I ring you up after I'd read chapter
You
one and
did.
say that chapter made me cry? That story
That's
made me
right.
cry.
That's right, because it was
Um,
such a shocking
It was
story.
such a shocking story. And then in
Mm.
the next chapter, I think it's Christy Henry who
That's
died
right.
as a result of an eating disorder.
That's
So
right.
and then, and it's just not just isolated cases. That's like the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? It's like the extreme
Mm.
cases. It results actually in death. But the book is
Mm.
full of all the harm done to these athletes through their participation.
Absolutely. And it's so remarkable. So many of those athletes who did make it through, when you listen to their interviews and their stories years afterwards, they
Mm.
all will explain how harmed and damaged they were by those environments in various different ways. I mean, Dominique Moceanu, her story kind of gets introduced right at the end of the book.
Yes.
And I've actually read her book as well, which is a
Oh, have you?
brilliant, brilliant book. But her kind of harm was, okay, the lack of childhood and all of these things we've already discussed in terms of injury and so on, but also financial abuse by her
Yes.
parents as well. And this really connects to me with the conversation that's happening in the world right now with them, kids who are TV stars and kids
Yeah.
of influencer parents, who these parents are making a lot of money off of the child labor of these children, but the
Yeah.
children never see the fruits of that money. And that's what happened to Dominique Moceanu
And it
as
was so
well.
shocking. I mean, so she kind of figured out when she was 17 that
Mm.
she'd earned a number of $1 million
Yeah, it was
in
in the
her career,
millions. Yeah.
and she'd never seen any of it. Whereas her
Mhm.
parents were building big house and everything, and her parents had not worked themselves for
That's
about 10
right.
years. So it was clear that they were living a fairly lavish lifestyle off the income of their child.
That's right.
So yeah, so when she was 17, she left home rather suddenly and started taking legal action against her parents.
That's right, and emancipated herself from her parents. And something that I meant to Google before we recorded was I read in the book yesterday that what was meant to happen was that her money was meant to be kept in a trust until she was 35.
35,
And
yeah.
I was wondering why
Why
35 and what
35?
happened with that? Did that actually, was that
Yeah.
done away with, or was that the case? And I find that really fascinating is like, what is going on there with this with
It
how
just sounds
these
so
kids are seen
paternalistic.
extremely,
I
and a
mean, so,
court order around that, or
I mean,
what was it?
usually in the UK, if you come into money as a child, it might be held in a trust fund till you were, say, 21 at the
That's
latest.
the latest. I mean, 18 most likely, but 21 maybe at the very
Yeah, but
latest.
35, that's just
35 was very
why
interesting
the
to me.
paternalism?
Yeah, yeah. And so, but also I think it came to light that her parents had already spent all of that money and had not
Right.
invested it wisely. So I don't even know if there was any of it left. I wanted to look that up, but that, that's for a different
And so
story.
there is a chapter actually on parents, isn't there?
Oh, let's
Which
talk about the
yeah, I mean that
parents.
seems part of the problem. That it's often the parents' dream of
Mm.
Olympic gold, and they kind of living vicariously through their children
Oh
because
my goodness,
they're not the
yes.
ones who have to get up at 6:30 every morning and spend 12 hours in a gym every day, but their
In an
children can.
abusive gym every day, working so
Yeah,
hard. Yeah, and it's really interesting to me. So, in many of the cases, it's the parents' dream, and in many of the cases, it kind of almost becomes the parents' dream. So, they start off, I think, with like good intentions. Oh, this little kid just wants to do gymnastics and she's good, so
mm,
I'm supporting her. But then you see this like sunk cost fallacy come into it, where the
yeah,
parents are often sacrificing a huge amount to be able to
yeah,
afford their kid to go to gymnastics.
yeah,
And then it's almost as if they become entitled to that kid's labor and the potential gold
yes.
medal down the
And
line. And it's
also just
shocking.
very obsessed. I mean, there was the guy who lived in his car, wasn't there? So
Yes,
so that his daughter could
that
could
was an ice
pursue this
skater.
dream. Oh, was it?
Yeah,
Was it?
yeah, yeah.
And it just seems um as you say, like a sunk cost, but also it was heartbreaking to see how many stories it involved the child saying, I want to give this up. I don't want to
That's
do this anymore.
right.
And the parents saying,
Forcing the kid
forcing them to say,
back.
well, you've come this far. It was your dream. You
Mm,
can't give up now. And they get forced back into it,
that's right.
where they're putting their bodies at risk in the ways
Mm,
we've already detailed,
mm,
and losing their childhood and not often not actually getting anything themselves from it.
mm,
So yeah, it came across that the there's various sort of people who you could think are at fault in all
mm.
this. So there's the coaching, there's the parents, there's also, I don't know if you drew this sort of conclusion as well, but there's
Hmm.
also the whole kind of framework and judging system. You
Yes.
know, so
Oh,
that
yes.
there's a point system that clearly kind of does actually require the gymnasts to have these kinds of bodies and or the ice
That's
skaters
right.
to have those bodies. So it is kind of driven by that. And if
It rewards it. That's
yes,
right.
so you've
Mm.
got to kind of just seem to me that the whole system, the elite sporting corporate system is complicit in all this.
Oh, absolutely. And even today there are some, I believe there are some um gymnastics moves. I'm not across all the language that Simone Biles is not allowed to do in competition, even if she can, because it's too good. Like she wouldn't get, high marks for them because she's too strong and so on. It does reward smallness and
Yeah.
daintiness still. But yeah, there is a whole chapter in this book about like politics and money, and I made quite a few
Yes.
notes about the federation and that whole constellation that makes up this system. And again, after the Larry Nassar abuse, there was a report that came out, the Ropes and Gray report, that spoke. They called it a constellation of abuse, and it was, Nassar was really just a kind of logical endpoint to
Mm.
all of these other things happening in that space. So very young children, often spending many hours away from their parents and other caregivers, with adults who see them as commodities. Often I was shocked by the stories of how these children went to live with their coaches. There are a few
Yeah.
stories in the book of children living with their
Yeah,
coaches,
and the
which
coach is kind of becoming their legal guardian, and
their
he's
legal guardian, that's right. And then, training through injury, not being allowed to eat, not eating enough, having to perform under these circumstances. It makes up an environment where no wonder sexual abuse happens, but where you can also then understand why many of the gymnasts who testified at the Nassau trial said Nassau was almost in many ways the least of our worries because all of this other abuse, psychological, financial, physical abuse, was happening to us all the time, every day. And we thought that that was just normal. And so NASA's abuse was just one more thing added to that.
yeah,
And that's shocking to say. Like, it's so hard to even fathom that.
yeah, there's a few bits in the book that hint at this. The idea that you could tell some of these girls, you could tell they were kind of dying inside
Mm.
and they'd lost any capacity to resist.
Mm. Or
So
they'd
what,
never been able to grow that, like
yeah.
to nurture that.
So if they were just told to do something, they would do it. So it's absolutely rife for the possibility of serious abuse.
Mm. And then, as you said, the training methods. There were 2 points in the book where I noted them talking about the militaristic training methods and the like the psychology of war that was being kind of
Mm.
used to create these soldiers.
So I said at the start it sort of changed my view of the sport.
Yes.
Um, so there was a case I've not been going back and watching it on YouTube like you did, but
Mm.
with one exception. So I read the story of is it Kerry Strang?
Strug, I think. Oh,
Strug.
Strug. Is it Strug? I
Yes,
could be wrong.
Kerry Strug at the 1996 Olympics.
Yes.
So
Oh, her vault.
yes, so
Yes, Kerry Strug. Yeah, that's right.
she performed a vault. So this was in the team event, and America were on the verge of winning it. They just needed the last event for them and the last vault.
That's
If it was
right.
just okay, it would be enough for them to get the gold. So Kerry Strug did her first vault and it went slightly wrong. She had a bad landing.
Mm.
She fell over in agony.
Mhm.
And what they subsequently found was that she'd torn the ligaments in her foot. but then she's got a second vault, and she came under, you can imagine the kind of pressure. She's in agony. Any sensible decision that was concerned with athlete welfare would be, right, you're
Well,
injured.
yeah, that's right. And she didn't need to do that second vault. It was like an optional to get some more points.
Right. So she
Yeah.
did a second vault knowing that she had a serious injury.
Mm.
And she landed basically just kind of on one foot because
Mhm.
she only had one good foot left.
Mm.
And she's clearly in agony, and she kind of did a duty to sort of finish it off in front of the
Mm.
judges, and then just collapsed. And
Mm.
America won the gold. Now I looked at the YouTube this morning, and the
Mm.
comments were full of how heroic this was, how noble it was. And
Mm.
I just had a totally different reaction. I thought, this is physical child
It
abuse.
is.
Okay, I think she was 18 at the time, so maybe she wasn't technically a child, but all through her career and
Oh
everything
my goodness,
building up to this,
she'd
she was a
been,
child.
yeah, that's
So
right.
just
There was
seeing,
no bodily autonomy there. She had
yeah.
absolutely no choice in the matter.
So
She
I felt
had to do
so
that.
uncomfortable, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to view gymnastics in the same way again.
I agree with you because I also I told you I went and watched that final too, and so I watched the whole final event, however many
Right.
hours that is, and it really is so uncomfortable when you get to that final vault, knowing what's coming and seeing that happening and knowing that um she had no option to say, I'm not doing that. And she ended up tearing another ligament. So it was two ligaments in her foot after that, and immense pain. And in the context of, as we were saying before, other athletes had died on the vault before when
Yeah.
they had been forced to vault under hard circumstances or injury and so on. And here was the whole world telling her that she was heroic for doing this. It just is, yeah, it goes against every human rights kind of
Yeah,
instinct in my body.
so I think it raises serious questions in sport about safeguarding and consent.
Mhm.
So I don't see how a child, um, even if they have this Olympic dream and they say they want to pursue the dream and they say they're there freely of their own,
Mm,
we do have a principle of safeguarding for children
agreed.
that, we have this thing called the age of consent, which is for something else, but I think it should apply here as well. So
I think so too. Has it changed your view on youth sport and what age you should be allowed to participate in elite sport or the Olympics?
well, it has changed my view, but I do think it's probably going to be sport sensitive, your
Mm,
judgment on this, because there are some sports I think put the athlete at risk of physical harm more than others, don't they? And
mm,
especially, well, first of all, it's kind of dangerous as gymnastics, but also add into that all the kind of issues around eating disorders and so
mm.
on, that I just feel you can't have 8-year-olds deciding to enter that world and thinking that they're in a position to choose that life for
Yeah, they just
themselves.
don't have enough information. They don't
Yeah.
know. That's right.
So
That's
that's where
right.
you need a safeguarding policy that comes in.
Agreed. Agreed
And I'm
massively.
and I'm not saying children shouldn't be allowed to start training for gymnastics, but I
No,
think
that's
the
right.
safeguarding needs to be looking at, well, what are we actually putting them through? If they keep asked to do more and more daring and
Mm,
dangerous maneuvers, then I think safeguarding should be stopping that.
massively,
But also
yeah.
the safeguarding should be looking at all the kind of possibilities of abuse
Mm.
around the organization of the sport.
That's right. And so I very much see that there's a difference between kids doing sport and learning the skills and taking part in sport for various other reasons as being quite different from a child participating in training for elite sport. and winning a
Yes.
gold medal, right? So, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think gymnastics is one of the best things for little kids to do in terms of like getting to know their bodies and their proprioception and, learning skills and so on. But that's a very different kind of gymnastics to training
Mm,
12 hours a day in an abusive gym and being treated as a commodity. I just glanced down at my notes and I don't know who this was referring to, but on one of the pages they said one of the athletes was completely dismissed by Bella Caroli after she had, I think, fallen in a competition or something.
yeah.
And he said she ceased to be a functioning asset,
Yeah.
and he was done with her, completely done with her. So that kind of, what does that do to a child to have to ingratiate themselves to their coaches and their parents by performing, always keeping quiet about their injuries and things that are happening to their bodies and just soldiering through?
Well, a few moments ago, you mentioned the E word, elite sports,
Mm,
and I know in the Feminist Sport Lab, we've been having some conversations around sporting
yeah,
futures.
yeah.
And I think that this also is one of the major causes of the problem that we're looking at here. The whole framework of elite sports,
Mm,
because we do see athletes in all sorts of other sports at the elite level who think the rewards in terms of finances or glory or whatever are so high that they are willing to put their body on the line, and I think I saw some survey data some years ago about many elite athletes say they would be willing to have their life shortened by 10 years
yes,
in order to achieve success in their sport.
that's right.
So
That's
again,
right.
I think there's safeguarding issues there.
Oh, hugely.
So I kind of feel that if we were building a feminist sport that focus on the elite, I would hope to see that erode, because sport should be about fun, it should be about self-expression, it should be about enjoyment,
Participation,
participation. When you get to
community,
elite level, we see none of that.
none.
Another striking case in the book, some of these athletes would win gold. And there was a diary entry from someone the day they won the
Yes,
gold, and it doesn't suggest any joy or pleasure. It was just a relief that they'd not failed.
that's right,
Uh,
because it's not for them, is it? It's for the coach and the federation and the country and everyone else who says they're brave. They don't get anything out of it. Yeah, that's the thing for me is elite sport is very toxic, and there's so much research out there now that shows that early sport specialization is actually really bad for kids, in that you're not more likely to become an Olympian if you specialize early in your sport or a world
mm,
champion. They're learning skills from various different sports, and participating in various different ways is actually really important. But on the other hand, too, like, yes, those people might say, I'm happy to sacrifice 10 good years of my life for this glory now. But we have to also think about it in terms of burden on the population, right? So if we funnel people into elite sports and they burn out and are injured and their bodies and minds are absolutely broken by it, what burden that does that put on themselves, first of all, very importantly, but also the health system and our
mm,
communities down the line. Whereas if we're creating a more, what we think, values, feminist values based kind of sport, where people are participating in sport and physical activity on a lifelong basis for
yes,
enjoyment and health and community and mental health and
yes,
all of that, what does that do for our communities and our populations?
yeah, yeah.
It's
So
that's
so
so much healthier.
it's a
Healthy
public
is
health.
a loaded word, but so much more feminist, I think,
Yeah.
than current approaches to sport. Mm.
So I I don't know if you've got anything else.
I have one more thing. It
Yeah,
wasn't
I've
in the
got
book
I've got one
though.
more thing, but
Okay,
you
let
you
me go
go you
first.
go first.
It
Yeah.
wasn't in the book, and actually, it's funny now. Most of my thoughts are about what I've been watching on YouTube
Yeah.
recently.
But because I'd been watching all these finals, I watched the Sydney 2000 Olympics finals again, because that is the first Olympics that I really remember watching. That one for me is the first one that really came into consciousness for me. And I remember watching the gymnastics because I saw the gymnasts that I remember watching. But something that I didn't know at the time of watching it, that I only found out in the last couple of days, is that the vault at the Sydney Olympics was set 5 centimeters too low. So it was meant to be 125 centimeters, but it was only 120 centimeters. And there are videos of this. The first half of the initial group of gymnasts, which were like, it was something like 130 different gymnasts, and about 60 or 70 of them had already gone, and every single one of them botched their vault, fell. There were terrible injuries from that vault. There were some of the gold prospects from that Olympics botched their vaults, and so were kind of
Well, I'm
out
not
of the
surprised.
competition. Yeah, because I mean, if
Five
you're a
centimeters is
gymnast,
going to be very significant when you practice that same
extremely.
vault hundreds of times.
In gymnastics, where things are so like
Yeah, I'd have
fine-tuned,
thought 1 centimeter wrong would be
definitely. And just think
significant.
about the potential implications for injury and death,
Yeah.
given what we know of the vault. So you see this, and then somehow one of the gymnasts realized that this, or not, I'm sure all of them realized, but one spoke up out of all of the gymnasts. And again, this speaks of this culture of, you just listen to what your coaches and your
Yeah.
federation tells you. If this vault is being botched by everyone, they took it as a personal problem. It's me
Yeah.
not performing. It's not, they didn't even consider that it was the equipment that was wrong.
Well, I bet it was also very Orwellian in that if we say it's 125, that it is
It is
125.
125, that's right. So they finally worked it out, and they gave the first half of the gymnasts another go at it. But by that time, many of them had already done their second apparatus and had botched their second apparatus because of,
Mm.
what had happened in the first one, and it completely skewed that whole gymnastics competition. But what did the Olympics do? They just carried on. And so the medalists at Sydney 2000 are slightly bizarre because
I
of
see.
that. Yeah. It's just like it's fascinating because again, I am not sure that would happen in many other sports.
Mm.
I think there are many sports that would restart the competition or do something to change that up. But because this is little girls, this is,
Yes, but it's
this
extremely
hierarchical,
patriarchal.
extremely patriarchal,
Yeah,
you will shut up and you will carry on, and
yeah,
we will do this thing as it's set up. Like we will just ignore this. I found it so shocking and
yeah.
fascinating. Mm.
Gosh. Well,
Now, what was your
the last thing I
comment?
wanted to say, I wanted to tell you how angry I got reading this book. Really angry.
Good.
Um, Angry for various reasons, but
Mm.
here's an extra one. In recent years, we've seen so many people claiming that they care about female athletes'
Oh
safety.
my goodness,
Yeah.
yes.
And you probably know what I'm talking about. You get people who talk about nothing but trans inclusion in women's sport, and they present this as if they care about the safety of women's sport and women's athletes, right? This book, as I said, it's in Sports Illustrated's top 100 sport books of all time, The Guardian's top 50. If I meet anybody ever again who claims to care about women's sport and they haven't read this book and don't know this book, I'm just going to tell them to go away
Yeah, can't take them
because
seriously.
this is this raises serious issues about safety in women's sport. This anybody who cares about women's sport, these are the sorts of issues you should care about.
Not
They have,
only should care about, these are the issues in women's sport.
yes,
These are
of
the
course,
only issues in women's sport. Trans women are not a freaking issue,
they're not an issue,
period.
and
There
it
are none of that.
shows,
And they talk about safety. They
yeah,
always talk about safety. These are the safety issues in women's sport.
yes.
These are.
So it shows, I think, that people who are not reading this book and just going on about that other issue really don't care about
Mhm.
safety of women
Mhm.
in sport.
That's right, because there is so much work to do here. Your hand is up.
I don't know how my hand went up, but clearly I wanted
This
to
is
get
a
on.
problem.
I
That's
wanted to get
right.
on my soapbox and
You do.
complain.
But that's it. Like, there are so many very serious concerns that this book highlights. And as I said when we started, these problems are all still there. We're still weighing
Yes.
athletes. This militaristic approach is
Yes.
still there
People are
in
dying.
coaching. There's abuse. This is not just what happened 20 years ago. This is still happening
Yeah.
today. And the fact that we talk about other things that are not a problem just takes us away
Yeah,
from
it
the
does.
actual real work in
It's what
women's
economists would call
sport.
the opportunity cost, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because while we're talking about this other stuff which doesn't
Hmm.
impact the safety of women's sport at all, there's people dying and getting serious injuries or being sexually abused.
That's right.
So
Exactly.
anybody, in future, if anybody comes to me with any of this stuff, I'm going to say, "Have you read Joan Ryan's book?" I'm going to say, "Well, go
And I'm
away."
going to bet you they've said no. They'll
They'll
say
say
no.
no, and I'll
Mm,
say, "Go away and read that, and then come back to me, and then I might be
exactly.
willing to have a conversation with you."
And if anyone tells you, oh, everything has changed post NASA, we've changed things,
Mm,
policies have changed, we've now got the US Center for Safe Sport, all of this has changed. I have some more news for you, because we now know that all of that was words on paper, and there was never, ever any real justice put behind that, any real teeth put into those policies. The US Center for Safe Sport, I'm sorry to say, is extremely
mm,
lax and minimal in what it does
mm,
to do safeguarding. Many of the coaches in this book are still coaching today, using those same abusive coaching practices, but they've just moved to other gyms or other countries.
mm.
It's and if you think it's only in gymnastics, that's another thing too. It's not,
Yeah,
it's in football too. I just thought of the Spanish coach who's now coaching Algeria,
yeah,
after all of the abuse that came to light there. They're allowed to just move anywhere. So yeah, I think that's the most important takeaway of this book. And this is one of the most radical books on sport out there, I would say. And if it doesn't radicalize you, then
absolutely. I mean, you say radical, but it's not as if it's some kind of strong leftist
oh no, that's not the
or
kind of
even
radical I
feminist
mean.
theoretical approach. It's just
No,
documenting.
radical for documenting the reality
Yeah, and
of
it
sport.
really changed my perspective. So this this gets my highest recommendation, actually. I mean, I think it's now one of my favorite ever books on sport. And if anybody was to come to me saying, I want to understand something about women's sport, I think this is going to be one of my
Number one.
top recommendations. Well, first of all, I'd say open play.
Well,
But
I
this book is a must read, I'd say. So
agree.
thank you for
Persisting.
introducing me to it and insisting that I read it. It's
Yeah, yeah.
totally changed my perspective on so many things.
Amazing. I'm so glad, and I'm so glad we could have this conversation about it, because I think we'll be continuing these conversations for years now, because there's so much in here. And yeah, we couldn't recommend this highly enough. So if anybody has read this book, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Or I'm always in the market for book recommendations that are similar to this book. If there's anything else like this, I would love to read it. But this one for me really is one of the best I've ever read, and will always stick with me. So yeah. Thank you, Stephen. This has been great.
Thank you, Sheree, and thank you anybody who's watched this far.